The night I lost my job, my sister shouted across the living room, asking who was going to pay her car loan now. My mother backed her up without a second thought. My father started packing my things, telling me my sister needed this house more than I did. I said nothing about the digital media company in my name or the beach house. Hours later, it all collapsed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our household meant learning early on that love was entirely conditional. I was the eldest, but somehow I was always the one expected to sacrifice. That particular Sunday evening, the rain was coming down in sheets when I finally walked through the front door of my parents' house. I was exhausted. My corporate marketing department had just been downsized, and I had spent the entire afternoon wrapping up my final deliverables. I walked into the living room hoping for just a fraction of sympathy. My sister Chloe was lounging on the sofa scrolling through her phone while her husband Trevor was flipping through television channels. My parents were in the kitchen cleaning up after their Sunday church dinner. I took a deep breath and announced that my department had been completely cut, and I was officially out of a job. The room went dead silent, but not out of shock or compassion. Chloe did not even look up from her phone when she shrieked, "Are you serious, Maya? So who is going to pay my car loan this month? You know my Tesla payment is due on Thursday and I absolutely cannot have it repossessed." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer selfishness of her words. Before I could even formulate a response, Trevor leaned against the mantel with that familiar condescending smirk he always wore. "I told you working for those black-owned startups was a mistake, Maya. There is no stability there. They never know how to run a real business. Now look at you. You are just dead weight to this family." My hands curled into fists. I stood there dripping wet, staring at a white man whose last 3 businesses had completely failed while he lived rent-free under my parents' roof. He had the audacity to lecture me about business stability when I was the one secretly keeping this entire family afloat. But in this house, Trevor was the golden boy by association, simply because he was married to Chloe and I was nothing more than an ATM machine they could tap into whenever they needed cash. My mother Brenda marched out of the kitchen, her church heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Instead of asking if I was okay, she walked right up to me and snatched my leather designer purse directly out of my hands. "You certainly do not need this to go to the unemployment office," she snapped, inspecting the stitching on the bag. "Leave it here. Chloe has an interview for the country club auxiliary board next week, and she needs to look presentable. You know how important church optics and social standing are to this family, Maya. We cannot have you dragging us down." The sheer audacity paralyzed me. For years, I had funded their lavish lifestyle. I had paid their credit card bills. I had even bought this very house under a blind LLC 5 years ago to save my parents from a humiliating foreclosure. But to them, I was just a scapegoat, a workhorse expected to carry their burdens while they paraded around pretending to be high society. Right on cue, my father Marcus came stomping down the stairs. He threw a large black plastic trash bag full of my clothes directly at my feet. The heavy bag hit the floor with a loud thud that made my chest tight. "Trevor is going through a rough patch with his crypto business," my father announced, refusing to even meet my eyes. "They need your room for the kids. You are 32 years old, Maya. It is time you figure things out on your own and stop depending on us." "Figure it out on my own." The words echoed in the tense living room. My sister was practically vibrating with entitlement while my brother-in-law smirked triumphantly. My parents stood shoulder to shoulder, protecting the very people who were actually draining them dry. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for my old bedroom back. They expected me to apologize for losing my job. Instead, I felt a profound, icy calm settle over my entire body. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the spare keys to the beat-up Honda Civic I kept parked in their driveway, specifically to maintain my cover. I tossed the keys onto the kitchen counter, where they clattered loudly against the granite. I bent down, picked up my laptop bag, and stepped right over the trash bag of cheap clothes they had hastily packed for me. I walked out the front door without saying a single word, stepping back into the freezing rain. As I walked down the driveway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from my executive assistant. "Boss, your private driver is outside. The Malibu beach house is fully prepped, and the staff is waiting for your arrival." I smiled, letting the rain wash away the very last bit of obligation I felt for this toxic family. I walked right past the rusty Honda and stepped into the back of the sleek black Maybach that had just glided up to the curb, leaving them all to drown in their own ignorance. Sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my master bedroom, warming the hardwood floors. Outside, the Pacific Ocean crashed against the Malibu shoreline, a steady, rhythmic reminder of the peace I had finally secured for myself. I sat up in my California king bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets pooling around my waist, and reached for my phone on the nightstand. I expected an update from my executive assistant regarding my digital PR agency. Instead, my screen was cluttered with 37 unread messages from the family group chat. The thread was appropriately named Family First, a title my mother Brenda had chosen years ago, without a shred of irony. I opened the chat, and the toxicity immediately bled through the screen. Chloe had sent a lengthy paragraph complaining that she had to cancel her morning Pilates class because my sudden unemployment was giving her severe anxiety. My father Marcus added a brief message reminding everyone that God tests us, but some people bring their own storms. Then came Trevor. My entitled brother-in-law could never resist an opportunity to kick me when he thought I was down. "Listen, Maya," Trevor wrote. "I know you are basically homeless now and scrambling. If you co-sign a $50,000 loan for my new logistics venture, I will talk to Marcus and Brenda. I will let you sleep in the garage until you find a low-level retail job. Do not say I never offered you a lifeline." I stared at the glowing screen, taking a slow sip of the sparkling water beside my bed. The sheer audacity of this man was breathtaking. He lived in my parents' house, ate the food I had secretly been paying for, and had the nerve to offer me a spot on a concrete floor in exchange for my credit score. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I replied, tagging him directly. "You mean just like the $100,000 business loan I paid off for you 3 years ago, the one you completely blew before bankrupting that artisanal coffee shop?" "No thanks, Trevor. I think I will pass on funding your next spectacular failure." I hit send and watched the chat explode. The typing bubbles appeared and disappeared frantically. Trevor fired back instantly, calling me an angry, bitter failure who was just jealous of his entrepreneurial spirit. He typed in all caps, demanding to know how a broke, unemployed spinster dared to disrespect a man who was actively trying to build generational wealth. Less than a minute later, Brenda chimed in. Her message was swift and dripping with her usual church lady self-righteousness. "Maya, you have gone too far," my mother wrote. "You are out of a job and out of a home. You do not have the standing to speak to the man of the house that way. You will call Trevor right now and apologize, or you can consider yourself completely cut off from this family." I did not bother typing a response. I tossed the phone onto the bed and walked out to the sprawling mahogany deck, wrapping my silk robe tighter against the crisp morning breeze. Let them revel in their imaginary superiority. I had an actual empire to run. My phone began to ring again. Thinking it was Brenda calling to scream at me, I almost ignored it. But the caller ID flashed the name of my wealth manager, David. I picked it up immediately. "Good morning, David," I said, leaning against the glass railing. "Please tell me we are closing on the commercial property in downtown Los Angeles today." "Good morning, Maya," David replied, his voice unusually tense. "We are on track for the commercial property, but that is not why I am calling. We have a massive situation regarding the residential asset in Connecticut, the primary property on Elm Street." My brow furrowed. The Elm Street property was my childhood home. 5 years ago, Marcus and Brenda were drowning in debt and facing imminent foreclosure. They were weeks away from being thrown out on the street. Instead of handing them cash, they would just squander. I quietly purchased the house through a blind LLC. I paid off the bank and allowed them to live there rent-free. They had no idea I was their landlord. They believed a corporate investor bought it and was giving them a grace period out of the goodness of their hearts. "What is wrong with the property?" I asked, gripping the railing. "Did they miss a utility payment again?" "Worse," David said. Maya. They just successfully took out a massive home equity line of credit on the house. $250,000. The funds cleared an hour ago. I froze. The sound of the ocean faded into the background. That is impossible, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. They do not own that house. My LLC owns that house. The bank would never approve a line of credit without the property owner's signature and corporate authorization. David let out a heavy sigh. That is exactly the problem, Maya. They bypassed the standard verification by submitting a fraudulent deed transfer. They used your old personal banking details and forged your signature as the primary guarantor. Because you are the registered agent of the LLC, the local branch pushed it through without triggering the high-level corporate alarms. Your parents committed identity theft and mortgage fraud. This is not just a family dispute anymore. This is a severe federal crime. I closed my eyes, letting the magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. While my father was throwing my clothes into a garbage bag and my mother was snatching my purse, they were simultaneously stealing $250,000 in my name. They had orchestrated my eviction to distract me from the fact that they were committing felony fraud against me. They thought I was a broke, unemployed marketing director who would never have the resources to fight back. They had absolutely no idea they had just defrauded a multi-millionaire CEO. The silence on the line stretched for a long moment. David cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Maya, he said, his tone entirely professional. I have our legal team on standby. Do you want me to call the police and have your parents arrested for felony forgery right now? We can freeze the funds and have them in handcuffs by noon. I opened my eyes and looked out at the vast, endless horizon of the Pacific Ocean. I thought about Chloe shrieking over her car loan. I thought about Trevor offering me a spot on the garage floor. I thought about Brenda demanding an apology for a man who was actively draining our family dry. If I sent the police now, they would play the victims. They would cry to the church and the extended family, claiming it was a misunderstanding and that their wicked daughter was trying to destroy them. That was not good enough. They needed to feel the absolute crushing weight of their own greed. I brought the phone back to my ear. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, staring at the crashing waves below. No, I said, my voice echoing with icy calm. Do not call the authorities yet. Let them spend the money first. I want them to fall from the very top. The morning sun glittered across the water as I ended the call with my wealth manager. I set my espresso cup on the glass table and picked up my phone. My notifications were swamped, but one specific alert caught my eye. Chloe was live on social media. I tapped the notification and watched my sister perform the role of a lifetime. She was standing in the immaculate kitchen of my childhood home, the very kitchen my money had renovated. She wore a soft beige sweater and a perfectly messy bun, staring mournfully into the camera. Chloe wiped away a completely dry tear and let out a heavy sigh. She told her thousands of mommy vlogger followers that God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. She went on a 5-minute rant about the heavy burden of taking in her struggling homeless sister. She painted herself as a saint for clearing out her guest room for an unemployed burden who refused to work hard. The comments flooded in, praising Chloe for her grace and her Christian charity. She ended the video by asking for prayers for my supposedly unstable mental health. I actually chuckled at the screen. She was harvesting sympathy points off a fabricated eviction while her husband was currently spending money stolen from my name. I dialed my legal team immediately. I gave them strict instructions on how to handle the fraudulent home equity line of credit my parents had authorized. I did not want the account shut down immediately. I wanted a federal fraud flag placed on the funds. My lawyer explained exactly how the trap would work. The bank system would still display the $250,000 balance in Trevor and Chloe's joint account. They would log in and see a massive pile of cash, making them feel invincible. But the second they tried to swipe their card for a major purchase, the transaction would hit a silent federal block. The money was a mirage. They were holding a bag of phantom cash and they had no idea. It took exactly 3 days for Trevor's fragile ego to demand an audience. I was sitting in my home office reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant forwarded me a link to Trevor's social media page. He was live streaming. I clicked the link and leaned back in my leather chair. Trevor was strutting through an exclusive luxury boat dealership in Marina del Rey. He wore designer sunglasses indoors and a flashy polo shirt, gesturing wildly at a sleek 60-foot speedboat. He was giving his handful of viewers a condescending lecture about the grind set and how real men build generational wealth. He bragged that his crypto logistics company had just closed a massive quarter. He literally patted the hull of the boat and announced to his live audience that he was about to drop a $20,000 deposit right then and there. I watched with pure fascination as he walked up to the sales manager holding his phone high to capture the moment. Trevor pulled a sleek metal credit card from his wallet and slammed it onto the glass counter with an arrogant smirk. The sales manager swiped the card. The machine beeped an angry, sharp tone. The manager frowned and tapped the screen. "It says declined, sir." Trevor let out a loud, forced laugh, telling his audience that sometimes the bank flags big purchases because his net worth is just too massive. He ordered the manager to run it again. The manager swiped a second time. The machine flashed red again. Declined. Trevor's smirk vanished. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He started yelling at the manager, accusing the dealership of having faulty equipment. He raised his voice, demanding respect and screaming about how much money he made. The sales manager remained completely stoic. He informed Trevor that the card was federally blocked and suggested he step away from the counter before security was called. The live chat on Trevor's stream went absolutely feral. Viewers were mocking him relentlessly, calling him a fraud and a clown. Realizing his entire humiliation was broadcasting to the internet, Trevor panicked. He aggressively fumbled with his phone and the screen went black. The stream ended abruptly. I laughed so hard my sides ached. The absolute unearned arrogance of that man was his own worst enemy. That same afternoon, my private security guard brought a heavy envelope up to the penthouse. It was delivered by a personal courier. The envelope was thick cream paper embossed with gold lettering. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out a VIP ticket to the annual Faith and Community Charity Gala. This was the most prestigious social event of the year for my parents' congregation. It was the night where the neighborhood elite gathered to flex their wealth under the guise of holy giving. A small handwritten card fell out from the invitation. I recognized my mother Brenda's sharp cursive script immediately. I read the words slowly. "Come see what real success looks like. Trevor is the diamond sponsor this year. Dress appropriately, please." I held the card between my fingers, my eyes scanning the arrogant words. Brenda truly believed she had won. She wanted me to sit in the overflow section and watch her fraudulent son-in-law receive a standing ovation for spending stolen money. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire community. I set the card down on my desk and a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. I would definitely be dressing appropriately. The annual church charity gala was the undisputed Super Bowl of respectability politics in my family. For my mother Brenda, it was never about the charity itself. It was a stage perfectly lit and aggressively managed. The massive fellowship hall had been draped in white silk and gold accents, completely transforming the modest space into a playground for the neighborhood elite. Brenda stood near the front by the premium VIP tables, holding a crystal glass of sparkling cider. She wore her absolute best pearls and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She spent the first hour pulling church elders aside, parading Trevor around like a prize-winning stallion. I heard exactly what she was saying through the grapevine of gossiping aunties. Brenda was putting on an absolute masterclass in performative sympathy. She leaned in close to Pastor Williams and whispered loudly enough for the surrounding tables to catch every single word. "We are just praying so hard for Maya right now," she murmured, pressing a hand to her chest. "She is going through a very dark, unemployed season. She has lost her way. But praise God for Trevor stepping up as the man of the family. He is our diamond sponsor tonight, you know." Chloe stood right next to her, nodding solemnly and adding how difficult it had been to support her struggling sister. Trevor puffed out his chest. adjusting his tailored suit jacket, acting as though his credit card had not just spectacularly declined at a luxury boat dealership 48 hours prior. They were practically drunk on their own fabricated narrative. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the fellowship hall swung open. The string quartet playing softly in the corner actually seemed to miss a beat. I stepped into the room wearing a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald silk gown. The rich fabric caught the ambient light with every step I took. I did not walk in looking like a broken, unemployed woman begging for scraps. I walked in like I owned the entire building. My executive assistant, Elena, flanked me holding a sleek leather portfolio and a professional posture that commanded respect. The shift in the room was instant and electric. The low hum of polite conversation stopped dead in its tracks. Dozens of heads turned in my direction, and the whispers immediately ignited. Aunties who had just been praying for my downfall were now staring open-mouthed at the authentic diamonds resting against my collarbone. From across the room, I saw the smug satisfaction completely melt off my mother's face. Her grip on her cider glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. Chloe actually choked on her appetizer, coughing violently into a napkin. Seeing their carefully crafted illusion threatened by my mere presence, Trevor immediately marched across the polished marble floor to intercept me. He positioned his broad shoulders right in my path, attempting to physically block me from reaching the premium tables at the front of the hall. He looked me up and down with a sneer of pure condescension. "Did you rent that dress, Maya?" he asked, his voice dripping with venom. "This is a high-ticket charity event, not a costume party. If you are here for a free meal, the overflow tables for the charity cases are in the back near the kitchen exits. Do not embarrass Brenda tonight. She has already cried enough tears over your financial failures. You do not belong up front with the actual donors." I stopped and looked up at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or intimidation. I simply smiled a cold, calculating smile that made him blink. "I bought the dress outright, Trevor," I said smoothly. "Just like I buy everything else in my life. By the way, I heard you tried to buy a boat this week. Tell me, how did that deposit go? I heard the dealership had to ask you to leave the premises because you threw a massive tantrum when your card got declined on a live stream." Trevor's face drained of all color instantly. He opened his mouth to stammer out a defense, but his voice failed him completely. He looked around, frantically terrified that someone had overheard me. His fake wealthy persona was cracking under the heavy weight of the absolute truth. Before Trevor could recover his wounded pride, the loud tap of a microphone echoed through the massive hall. Pastor Williams stood at the podium, beaming under the bright stage lights. The room fell entirely silent as everyone turned their attention to the front. "Welcome, brothers and sisters," the pastor boomed, his voice filled with overwhelming joy. "Tonight, we are gathered to celebrate absolute generosity and community spirit. As you know, we have been trying to raise funds for the new Youth Technology Center for 3 long years. It has been a difficult journey, but tonight I am overjoyed to announce that we have not only met our financial goal, but we have exceeded it, thanks to a single historic donation." At the front table, Brenda patted Trevor aggressively on the back. Trevor puffed his chest back out, pasting on a fake smile, ready to take his grand victory lap. Chloe held up her smartphone, recording a video to capture her husband's big moment for her social media followers. "We want to extend our deepest gratitude to our true diamond sponsor, Pastor Williams," announced, his voice ringing with pure admiration. "The sole benefactor of the new community center, the brilliant CEO and founder of Digital Empire, Miss Maya." The stage spotlight swiveled instantly, cutting through the dark room and landing directly on me. The entire congregation gasped in unison. Chloe dropped her phone onto the table with a loud, heavy clatter, and Brenda, standing completely frozen in absolute shock, let her crystal glass slip right through her trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered into 100 pieces. The sharp crack of shattering crystal echoed through the silent fellowship hall. Brenda stared down at the sparkling cider soaking into her expensive shoes, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. A split second later, the entire room erupted. Pastor Williams started clapping enthusiastically, and soon hundreds of congregation members were on their feet, giving me a standing ovation. I remained exactly where I was, letting the blinding stage spotlight wash over me. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at Chloe. I simply offered a gracious, composed nod to the stage. Elena stood beside me with perfect posture, holding my portfolio like a royal guard. The applause was deafening. These were the same people who just 20 minutes ago were whispering prayers for my supposedly tragic unemployed soul. Now they were applauding the very empire I had built while they were busy underestimating me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the absolute meltdown occurring at the VIP table. Marcus was gripping the edge of the white linen tablecloth so hard his knuckles were stark white. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a horrific accident. Chloe was a masterpiece of panic. Realizing her phone was still actively live streaming to her thousands of followers, she scrambled to recover her image. She plastered on a rigid, trembling smile that made her look physically ill. She turned the camera toward me, her voice pitching up an unnatural octave as she forced out a cheer, trying desperately to pretend she knew about my success all along. But her eyes were wide with sheer terror. As the applause finally began to taper off, and the string quartet resumed playing, the gala shifted into the dinner service. People began swarming my table. Church elders, local politicians, and neighborhood socialites were suddenly eager to shake the hand of the elusive CEO they had just been gossiping about. I greeted them with practiced warmth, answering their invasive questions with measured grace. After 20 minutes of relentless networking, I signaled to Elena that I needed a brief reprieve. I left the loud, crowded ballroom and stepped out into the dimly lit, quiet corridor leading toward the coat check and the private administrative offices. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, muting the chatter. I barely had time to take a deep breath before the heavy doors violently pushed open again. Fast, aggressive footsteps echoed against the marble floor. I turned slowly. Trevor was marching down the hallway, his face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. The tailored suit that had looked so sharp an hour ago now seemed to hang awkwardly on his tense, rigid frame. He closed the distance between us in seconds, practically backing me against the polished oak wainscoting near the empty coat check counter. He slammed his hand against the wall right next to my head, deliberately invading my personal space in a pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. "I do not know what kind of sick game you are playing, Maya." Trevor snarled his breath, smelling faintly of the expensive scotch he had undoubtedly sneaked in. "But you are not fooling me. I do not know who you are sleeping with to fake this CEO title or what kind of shady corporate front you have set up to impress these gullible church people. But you and I both know you are nothing." I stared at him, my expression completely blank. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away. I just watched him unravel. "You think you are so smart?" Trevor continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You think you can walk in here and humiliate this family? I know the truth, Maya. I logged into your old personal bank account yesterday, the one attached to the joint family safety deposit box. You have exactly $12 in checking. $12. You are a broke, pathetic fraud putting on a rented light show. The second I walk back into that ballroom and tell Pastor Williams the truth, your little charade is over." He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for me to panic. He expected tears. He expected me to negotiate or to beg him to keep my secret. Instead, I let a long, suffocating silence stretch between us. I reached out and calmly brushed a piece of invisible lint off his suit lapel. "You just admitted to a federal cybercrime, Trevor." I whispered, my voice smooth and lethal. "Accessing a financial account that is not yours across state lines carries a mandatory minimum sentence." I paused, letting the absolute reality of my words sink into his thick skull. I watched his confident posture waver. Then I tilted my head, locking my eyes entirely onto his. "By the way," I asked casually, "how did that boat deposit go?" Trevor froze. The smug arrogance melted off his face, replaced instantly by sheer, unadulterated horror. His skin went ghost white as the pieces violently clicked together in his mind. He stared at me with his mouth slightly ajar, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He realized in that agonizing second that I was not just a successful CEO. He realized I was the one holding the leash to his entire fabricated life. Trevor stumbled backward, physically shrinking under the weight of my words. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the kitchen exits, exactly where he had tried to banish me moments earlier. I smoothed the emerald silk of my gown, took a fresh glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, and spent the rest of the evening networking with the true power players of the city. My parents avoided me like the plague, hiding in the shadows of the fellowship hall, while the congregation buzzed about my historic donation. I left the gala feeling completely untouchable, stepping into the cool night air with absolute certainty that the worst was behind me. But toxic families have a remarkable talent for amnesia when money is involved. The very next morning, the Los Angeles sun was pouring into my penthouse corporate office. Digital Empire occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass high-rise in Century City. I was sitting behind my custom obsidian desk, reviewing international acquisition files, when the intercom buzzed. It was Elena, my executive assistant, her voice tight with professional restraint. She informed me that 4 individuals had bypassed the lobby security by screaming about a family medical emergency and dropping my name. Before I could even instruct Elena to call building security and have them escorted out, my heavy glass office doors swung wide open. In marched the entire circus. Brenda Marcus. Chloe and Trevor strode into my inner sanctum as if they owned the building. The absolute whiplash of their attitudes was staggering. Just a week ago, they had thrown my cheap clothes into a trash bag and kicked me out into the freezing rain. Last night, they had tried to banish me to the charity tables. Today, they were practically vibrating with forced aggressive affection. My father Marcus took the lead. He bypassed the guest chairs, entirely walking right up to my desk with his arms spread wide and a booming, jovial laugh. He looked around at the modern art and the panoramic view of the Hollywood Hills. "We always knew you had it in you, baby girl," Marcus declared, his voice thick with unearned pride. "I told your mother just the other day that our Maya was destined for greatness. You know how it is in business, right? Sometimes a father has to use tough love to push his bird out of the nest so she can soar. Family sticks together, Maya. We are so incredibly proud." I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my laptop keyboard. Tough love, that was what he was calling it now. Brenda rushed forward next, her eyes darting around the luxurious office, taking a mental inventory of my net worth. She reached across the desk, aggressively trying to pull me into a motherly embrace. I smoothly rolled my ergonomic chair backward, leaving her grasping at empty air. Brenda did not even have the grace to look embarrassed. She seamlessly transitioned the failed hug into a dramatic gesture at the floor-to-ceiling windows. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Brenda praised, her voice dripping with syrupy sweetness. "We were just testing your faith last week, Maya. We knew you had secured your future. We just wanted to see if you would stay humble. And look at this magnificent blessing. This office is the perfect place for our family enterprise to grow." Our family enterprise. The delusion was almost suffocating. Before I could dissect Brenda's ridiculous attempt at rewriting history, Trevor stepped up to the desk. The sheer audacity of this man belonged in a medical journal. He completely ignored the devastating humiliation he had suffered in the church hallway less than 12 hours ago. He straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and slammed a thick, glossy binder down onto my immaculate glass desk. "I opened a logistics company," Trevor announced, puffing out his chest with unearned confidence. "We are going to revolutionize freight transport on the West Coast. But to scale properly, we need capital. I am offering you the ground floor opportunity to secure your place in this family. I need a $500,000 family investment. Consider it your way of making up for the disrespect you showed us last week." I stared at the glossy binder, then up at Trevor. He was genuinely demanding $500,000. He framed it as a favor to me, a chance to buy my way back into their good graces. He had the nerve to stand in my multi-million-dollar headquarters wearing a suit paid for by the funds he stole from me and demand more. When I did not immediately reach for my checkbook, Chloe decided it was time to activate her ultimate weapon. She stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure manufactured anguish. She squeezed her eyes shut until tears began to roll down her cheeks, perfectly on cue. "You owe us this, Maya," Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking with calculated precision. "My kids need security. Your nieces and nephews need to know their aunt cares about their future. Trevor has been working so hard and you have all this money just sitting around while we stress about our bills. Do not do this. Do not be a selfish, angry black woman. Be the bigger person and help your family." The room went completely silent. The racial trope, the aggressive gaslighting, the weaponization of my nieces and nephews. It was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. The sheer viciousness of her employing that specific degrading stereotype to guilt-trip me was the final nail in the coffin of our sisterhood. They genuinely believed that if they pushed the right emotional buttons, the guilt would override my logic. They expected me to break down, apologize for my success, and hand over the keys to my empire just to prove I was not the angry stereotype Chloe was projecting onto me. I slowly took my hands off my laptop keyboard. I let the silence stretch, watching them squirm under my icy, unblinking gaze. I reached across the desk and picked up Trevor's ridiculous glossy proposal. I weighed it in my hand for a second, then tossed it carelessly into the sleek metal trash can beside my desk. Trevor gasped. Chloe's fake crying hitched in her throat. I opened my top drawer and pulled out a thick, bright red folder. I dropped it onto the center of the glass desk with a heavy, definitive thud. "I do not owe you a single dime," I said, my voice dangerously soft, echoing with absolute authority. "But you owe the bank $300,000 for the fraudulent HELOC you took out on my house." The silence that followed my revelation was absolute. Trevor stared at the red folder as if it were a live grenade. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. The bank statements, the forged signatures, the digital footprint he thought he had so cleverly masked. He had secretly leveraged the house I paid for to fund his failing logistics company, and now the massive bill was due. Marcus staggered back a step, clutching the edge of a leather guest chair. Chloe gasped loudly, finally dropping her fabricated crying act as true panic set in. $300,000 meant immediate bankruptcy. It meant losing the fake wealthy lifestyle she flaunted online for her followers. But Brenda did not look at the folder. She looked at me, and the last remnants of her pious church lady persona instantly vaporized. The sweet, supportive mother facade shattered, revealing the bitter, resentful woman underneath. Her face twisted into a snarl, her eyes narrowing with pure, unfiltered venom. "You think you are so special!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You sit up here in your little glass tower, looking down on your own blood. You are nothing but a whitewashed, arrogant girl who forgot her roots the second she got a little bit of money. You think this fancy desk makes you better than us. You are a traitor to this family, Maya." I did not raise my voice. I did not even stand up. I simply leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. "Forgetting my roots," I asked smoothly. "Like how you made me chemically straighten my natural hair for 6 agonizing years so I would not embarrass Trevor in front of his wealthy friends at those ridiculous country club dinners. You literally burned my scalp with relaxers so your golden boy could play pretend in a world he could not afford. You stripped away my identity to serve his ego. Do not ever speak to me about my roots, Brenda." She opened her mouth to screech another insult, but I was already done. "Get out of my building," I commanded. "You cannot talk to your mother like that," Marcus bellowed, finally finding his voice. "We are not leaving until we get what we came for. Trevor needs that investment, Maya, and you are going to write the check right now." I did not bother replying to his delusion. I simply reached my hand under the lip of my desk and pressed the silent security button. Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy double doors of my office swung open with a definitive bang. 3 heavily armed corporate security guards stepped into the room. They were massive, imposing men wearing tailored black suits, moving with silent military precision. The lead guard locked eyes with me for confirmation. I gave him a single sharp nod and gestured toward my so-called family. "Escort them out," I said coldly. If they resist, call the police and press trespassing charges. Trevor instinctively puffed out his chest, trying to salvage whatever microscopic shred of masculinity he had left in front of his wife. He squared his shoulders and pointed a shaking finger at the lead guard. "Do not touch me," Trevor barked, attempting to sound authoritative. "We are leaving on our own terms. You work for my sister Buddy, so you better watch your tone." The guards were entirely unimpressed. The lead guard stepped forward seamlessly, grabbing Trevor by the upper arm and twisting him into compliance with a swift, practiced motion. Trevor let out a high-pitched yelp of pain as his bravado instantly evaporated. "Get your hands off my husband," Chloe shrieked, swatting frantically at the second guard who was already herding her toward the door. Brenda was practically foaming at the mouth, screaming about lawsuits and divine retribution as the third guard firmly guided her and Marcus out of my office. They were frog-marched out of the executive suite and directly into the main open-plan office space. I walked to my office door and watched the spectacle unfold. My entire staff, dozens of top-tier analysts, developers, and executives, had stopped working. They stood at their desks watching in stunned silence as the noisy, chaotic group was paraded through the pristine corporate environment. Trevor was stumbling over his own expensive shoes, whining about his shoulder. Chloe was hiding her face from the staff, afraid someone might recognize her from her fake luxury social media account. Marcus was red-faced and humiliated, while Brenda continued to shout obscenities until the heavy elevator doors finally slid shut, cutting off her voice. I walked back to my desk, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I tapped a few keys on my laptop, bringing up the lobby security camera feeds on my large wall-mounted monitor. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the guards escorted them out of the building and physically dumped them onto the busy Century City sidewalk. They looked exactly like what they were: frauds who had finally been evicted from a world they did not belong in. Just as I was about to close the security feed, my office door chimed and slid open. David, my lead tech engineer, stepped into the room holding a sleek silver tablet. His usual relaxed demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He locked the door behind him and walked quickly toward my desk. "Boss David," said, his voice low and urgent, "we have a massive red flag on the financial monitoring software we set up on your old network." I turned my attention away from the monitors. "What did you find, David?" He slid the tablet across my glass desk. The screen displayed a complex web of encrypted data transfers and flashing red warning codes. "Someone is actively trying to route funds from your parents' joint retirement accounts," David explained, tapping a specific line of code. "They are attempting to wire liquid cash, completely bypassing the standard banking hold periods. The destination is an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands." I stared at the rushing data. My parents were financially illiterate. They barely knew how to log into their online banking, let alone set up encrypted offshore wire transfers. "Who is initiating the transfer?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. David looked me dead in the eye. "We traced the digital signature right past the VPN blockers. The IP address matches Trevor's phone." I stared at the flashing red numbers reflecting off the polished surface of my desk. The sheer magnitude of Trevor's betrayal hung heavy in the silent office. He was not just trying to save his failing logistics company anymore. He was fleeing the sinking ship and using our parents as his personal golden parachute. After decades of Brenda and Marcus sacrificing my mental health, my finances, and my dignity to build a pedestal for their perfect son, that same son was currently draining their life savings to escape to the Cayman Islands. "Shut it down," Boss David said, his fingers hovering over his tablet, ready to execute the kill command. "I can freeze the routing protocol before the cash leaves their domestic accounts. We can lock him out right now." I slowly leaned back in my ergonomic chair, pressing my fingertips together. A cold, profound sense of clarity washed over me. I thought about the chemical burns on my scalp from childhood. I thought about the $12 in my checking account he had mocked just 24 hours ago. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated entitlement of him marching into my building and demanding $500,000. "Let it go through," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. David blinked, looking up from his screen. "Maya, They are transferring the entire liquid balance of your parents' retirement portfolios. If this crosses international waters, we cannot pull it back. I know, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the digital map tracking the money. Do not block the transfer, David. But do not mask it either. Let it hit the federal wire fraud tripwire. David's eyes widened as the realization dawned on him. He nodded slowly, a sharp grin touching the corners of his mouth. As soon as this hits the offshore relay, it triggers an automatic alert with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It goes from a local family dispute to a federal cybercrime investigation in about 3 seconds. Exactly, I murmured, watching the loading bar on the screen inch toward 100%. Trevor wants to act like a corporate mastermind. Let him face federal consequences. Monitor the transaction log, the digital footprint, and send the entire encrypted file to my secure drive. Let him dig his own digital grave. While Trevor was quietly siphoning away his parents' future, Brenda and Marcus were blissfully ignorant, dedicating their entire existence to saving face. The Century City security ejection had rattled them, but it had not humbled them. Word of their spectacular humiliation at the church gala was already spreading through the neighborhood grapevine faster than a wildfire. Aunties were gossiping. Deacons were whispering. The carefully curated illusion of the wealthy, successful family was cracking at the foundation. To combat the truth, Brenda decided to do what she always did. She threw money at the problem. She immediately sent out digital invitations for an impromptu, massive annual family cookout. It was a desperate, calculated public relations stunt designed to get ahead of the narrative. She invited every cousin, uncle, church elder, and neighborhood socialite she could find. Through the family group chat, which I was still silently monitoring, I watched their strategy unfold in real time. Brenda and Marcus were using the upcoming cookout to paint me as the villain. They were telling the extended family that the wealth had driven me insane. They claimed I was a bitter, jealous woman who had lost touch with reality and violently turned my back on the very people who built me. The cookout was meant to be a grand display of their unity and financial stability. They were going to serve premium steaks, hire a live band, and project absolute unbothered perfection. I was sitting in my living room sipping a cup of black coffee 2 days later when my personal cell phone illuminated with a high-priority fraud alert. It was an automated notification from a premium credit card app. I furrowed my brow, picking up the device. It was an old joint account I had opened nearly a decade ago. Back then, I had foolishly co-signed a card for my parents to help them consolidate some medical debt and rebuild their credit score. I had completely forgotten the account even existed, let alone that it was still active. I opened the application and stared at the pending transaction log. A $15,000 charge had just been initiated. It was broken down into 2 distinct authorizations. $7,000 was routed to an elite luxury event rental company for massive outdoor canopies, tables, and staging. The remaining $8,000 was charged to a high-end catering service known for premium seafood and prime cuts of meat. The audacity was staggering. Brenda and Marcus were funding their anti-Maya propaganda party using my line of credit. They were using my money to feed the exact same people they were actively turning against me. They assumed that because of my new wealth, I simply would not notice a $15,000 charge slipping through the cracks. They thought they could still use me as their personal bankroll while simultaneously destroying my name. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly efficient. I tapped the screen, dialing the Platinum Concierge service attached to the account. "Good afternoon," the representative answered politely. "How can I assist you today? I am calling to report a stolen card," I said, my tone brisk and authoritative. "I am the primary account holder. I need to report unauthorized fraudulent charges made by secondary users." "I can certainly help you with that," the representative replied, clicking audibly on her keyboard. "I see 2 large pending transactions initiated in the last hour. Would you like me to flag those?" "Flag them, decline the authorizations, and permanently close the account," I instructed. "Do not issue a replacement card to the secondary users." "Consider it done, ma'am. The funds will bounce back immediately, and the vendors will be notified of the declined payments." I ended the call and placed my phone back on the marble counter. It was exactly 24 hours before Brenda's grand event. I pictured the scene that was about to unfold at my parents' suburban home. The frantic phone calls from the event planners. The luxury tent delivery trucks pulling up to the curb only to refuse service because the deposit suddenly vanished. The elite caterers abruptly canceling the massive food order, leaving Brenda with an empty backyard and 100 hungry, gossiping relatives scheduled to arrive the very next afternoon. They wanted to show the world how wealthy and unified they were. Now they were going to have to explain to the entire neighborhood why they could not even afford to buy hot dogs for their own party. Sunday afternoon arrived with blistering heat and absolute social devastation for my parents. Brenda's meticulously manicured suburban backyard was usually the stage for her most triumphant neighborhood displays. Today it was the site of her spectacular public unraveling. Dozens of extended family members, church elders, and neighborhood socialites had arrived in their Sunday best, expecting the lavish, catered affair Brenda had spent the last 48 hours aggressively bragging about. Instead, they walked through the side gate to find an empty, sunburned lawn devoid of the promised luxury tents, the string quartet, or the premium seafood buffet. Brenda stood near the edge of the patio, desperately fighting a losing battle against a rusted charcoal grill that had not been used in a decade. Thick, foul-smelling black smoke billowed directly into her face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving her coughing violently. She was frantically flipping discount store hot dogs and burnt hamburger patties with a cheap plastic spatula. The optics were nothing short of catastrophic. I could practically hear the collective judgment radiating from the folding chairs. Auntie Denise and Uncle Robert stood near the wilted hydrangeas, whispering furiously while staring down at their flimsy paper plates. The low hum of gossip was completely suffocating. Brenda kept offering high-pitched manic laughs, blaming the catering company for a supposed scheduling error, but nobody was buying the lie. The sheer embarrassment radiating from my parents was palpable. To combat the overwhelming humiliation, Chloe was actively working the crowd. She floated from group to group, wearing a sundress and a deeply practiced look of profound sorrow. She was putting on an absolute masterclass in gaslighting. "I had warned Marcus and Brenda this would happen," Chloe whispered loudly to a group of church ladies clutching a plastic cup of lukewarm fruit punch. "Maya is completely unstable right now. She froze all of our family business accounts out of pure spite. She is mentally unwell. We are just praying for her to find peace. She deliberately sabotaged this beautiful family gathering because she cannot stand seeing us happy." The church ladies gasped, clutching their pearls and shaking their heads in synchronized pity. Chloe nodded tragically, dabbing at completely dry eyes. She was weaponizing my absence, using my supposed mental breakdown to explain away their sudden poverty. She was painting me as the ultimate villain to preserve her fake wealthy aesthetic. But while Chloe was busy spinning a web of lies, her husband was completely falling apart. Trevor stood isolated near the sliding glass patio doors, entirely detached from the social disaster unfolding on the lawn. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of perspiration rolling down his forehead and soaking the collar of his designer polo shirt. He was staring at his smartphone screen, his thumb frantically swiping down to refresh his banking application. He was terrified. He had been waiting for the massive offshore wire transfer to clear for 24 hours. He assumed the delay was just a standard international banking hold over the weekend. He had absolutely no idea that his digital fingerprints were currently sitting on the desk of a federal investigator. He was literally stealing the last remaining dollars from his own parents' retirement accounts, preparing to flee the sinking ship and leave them bankrupt. His complete lack of loyalty to the very people who had worshipped him his entire life was sickening. The tense, awkward atmosphere in the backyard was suddenly shattered by the heavy, unmistakable crunch of thick tires pulling onto the gravel driveway. The cheap Bluetooth speaker Brenda had set up on the patio was blaring upbeat pop music, but the sheer commanding presence of the arriving vehicles seemed to drown it out entirely. Two massive black Cadillac Escalades rolled to a smooth stop directly in front of the house. The heavy tinted windows obscured the interior completely. The music playing from the patio speaker was abruptly turned off. A dead, heavy silence fell over the entire cookout. Every single relative, church member, and neighbor stopped talking and turned to stare at the driveway. The heavy doors of the lead SUV swung open with a synchronized solid thud. Two towering corporate security guards stepped out wearing tailored black suits and earpieces, scanning the yard with cold professional intensity. My lead corporate attorney Richard followed, stepping out of the second vehicle, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Then I stepped out of the back of the lead Escalade. I was wearing a flawless, effortless ensemble of ivory silk trousers and a tailored blazer. I looked exactly like what I was. A woman who owned her entire life and did not lose a single second of sleep over the opinions of the people staring at her. I adjusted my sunglasses and walked smoothly up the driveway, my security detail and lawyer flanking me like a barricade. I did not look angry. I looked entirely unbothered. The collective gasp from the backyard was audible. Auntie Denise actually dropped her paper plate, the burnt hot dog rolling into the grass. Chloe froze mid-sentence, her jaw practically unhinged. Trevor looked up from his phone, his eyes widening in pure absolute terror as he realized the woman he had tried to destroy had just arrived to finish the job. Seeing his entire manufactured narrative actively collapsing in front of his extended family, Marcus completely lost whatever shred of rational thought he had left. His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. He gripped the cheap plastic spatula in his hand like a weapon and stormed across the sunburned lawn to intercept me before I could reach the patio. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Maya." Marcus bellowed, his voice cracking with rage and utter humiliation. "You do not belong here. Get off my property right now before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still on the manicured walkway, my expression completely void of any intimidation. I slowly lowered my sunglasses, looking my father directly in his furious, panicked eyes. "Go ahead, call them," I said, my voice slicing through the dead silence of the yard like a blade. "Let us see exactly who they arrest today." Marcus froze. The cheap plastic spatula in his hand trembled, sending a rogue drop of dirty hot dog water onto the toes of his loafers. The brazen confidence in my voice completely derailed his aggressive posturing. Bullies rely on fear, and the absolute absence of it in my eyes left him utterly paralyzed. He glanced nervously at the two hulking security professionals flanking me, their tailored suits stretching over dense muscle, their eyes scanning the yard with cold, tactical precision. Then he looked at Richard, my corporate attorney, who stood silently holding a thick crimson folder with an expression of predatory calm. Marcus took a slow, defeated step backward. His bluff had been called in front of half the congregation. The heavy, suffocating silence of the backyard broke. Whispers rippled through the rows of cheap folding chairs like a sudden gust of wind. Auntie Denise, never one to hold her tongue, leaned over to Uncle Robert. Chloe said Maya was completely broke and losing her mind. Auntie Denise murmured, her voice carrying sharply across the sunburned grass. "That girl does not look broke. She looks like she owns the bank." Hearing that specific whisper was the final devastating blow to Chloe's fragile psyche. All afternoon she had been floating between groups of relatives, putting on a masterful, tear-streaked performance. She had spun an elaborate web of lies, claiming my mental instability was the reason for their sudden lack of catered luxury. She had painted me as a bitter, unhinged villain who had frozen their accounts out of spite. But standing there in my immaculate ivory silk trousers, flanked by a top-tier legal and security team, I was the living, breathing antithesis of her desperate fiction. Chloe looked around the yard, her manicured hands shaking as she witnessed her entire social currency disintegrating in real time. The judging eyes of the extended family were no longer aimed at me. They were pinned directly on her. The wealthy influencer persona she had meticulously cultivated using my stolen credit lines was burning to the ground. Panic is a dangerous catalyst for the foolish. Chloe's eyes darted wildly until they locked onto a large, heat-warped aluminum cup sitting precariously on the edge of Brenda's rusted charcoal grill. It was filled to the brim with boiling, foul-smelling grease that Brenda had frantically scraped off the grates earlier. A vicious, unhinged light sparked in Chloe's eyes. If she could not outsmart me, she decided to disfigure me. She lunged for the grill, her fingers wrapping around the scalding aluminum. Without a single word of warning, she charged across the lawn. Her intention was crystal clear. She wanted to throw the boiling, dirty grease directly into my face, permanently scarring me and ruining the pristine outfit that proved my superiority. She let out a guttural, feral shriek as she sprinted forward, her expensive wedge heels sinking into the patchy dirt. The crowd screamed in collective horror. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to protect my face. I did not even break eye contact with her. I simply waited until she was less than a yard away, and then I took one fluid, effortless step to the left. Chloe's desperate momentum carried her violently forward. Her designer heel caught on a thick, exposed tree root hidden beneath the dry grass. Her ankle twisted with a sickening, audible pop. Unable to stop herself, she pitched headfirst into the empty air where I had just been standing. The cup jerked in her grip, hurling the boiling grease backward in a wide arc that splashed directly onto her own bare legs and chest. She let out a piercing wail of agony, but gravity was not finished with her. She launched face first toward the main buffet station. She crashed spectacularly into the center of the folding table, landing belly down directly into a massive, overflowing aluminum tray of mayonnaise-heavy potato salad. The flimsy plastic table immediately buckled under the violent impact. It collapsed into a heap of twisted metal legs and shattered bowls, taking Chloe down into the dirt with it. She rolled onto the grass, coughing, sputtering, and thrashing in absolute humiliation. Her perfect salon-styled blowout was plastered to the side of her face with thick yellow mayonnaise and chunks of boiled potatoes. Her exclusive designer sundress, the one she had undoubtedly purchased using the joint credit card I had just canceled, was completely ruined, smeared with black grill grease, dirt, and sticky mustard. The cookout erupted into absolute chaos. Several aunts shrieked in shock, while a group of teenage cousins in the back row openly burst into hysterical laughter. The great, untouchable influencer was rolling in the dirt like a greased pig, sobbing uncontrollably as her fabricated empire was literally and figuratively wiped away in front of her most important audience. Trevor had been standing near the sliding glass patio doors, entirely detached from the party. He had spent the last hour sweating profusely, frantically, refreshing his banking application over and over again, praying for his offshore wire to clear so he could abandon the very people currently defending him. But as he watched his wife humiliated, covered in garbage, and laughed at by the relatives who usually worshipped the ground he walked on, something inside his fragile narcissistic ego completely snapped. The mask he had worn his entire life, the charming, progressive, wealthy golden boy, completely shattered. He shoved his phone into his pocket and charged across the lawn toward me. His face was contorted into a violently ugly mask of pure rage. As he sprinted, he began screaming. He did not yell about the money or the humiliation. He yelled foul, derogatory, and explicitly racial slurs he had previously kept hidden behind his fake country club smile and corporate buzzwords. It was the ultimate exposure of his true character, revealing the deep, rotting prejudice he actually held toward the family roots he claimed to cherish. His fists were balled tight, his eyes wide and manic. He fully intended to physically assault me to restore his shattered pride. He never even made it within 3 feet of me. My security detail moved with terrifying synchronized speed. Before Trevor could even raise his arm to strike, the lead bodyguard stepped smoothly into his path. The guard seized Trevor by the collar and the wrist, executing a flawless tactical sweep that knocked Trevor's legs entirely out from under him. Trevor slammed into the dry, sunburned earth with a heavy, breathless thud that kicked up a cloud of dust. Before he could even draw a breath to scream, the second guard dropped his full body weight, driving a knee squarely into the center of Trevor's back and pinning him face down in the dirt. The guards twisted his arms behind him, locking him into a firm, unyielding compliance hold. Trevor thrashed and kicked, spitting grass and dirt out of his mouth, but he was completely immobilized. He was finally forced to eat the dust he had always believed he was too good to walk on. Brenda, who had been frozen in shock by the smoking grill, finally snapped out of her stupor. Seeing her precious golden boy pinned to the dirt by my security detail shattered whatever restraint she had left. She dropped her plastic spatula and sprinted across the lawn, waving her arms frantically. "Let my son-in-law go!" Brenda screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "Get your hands off him! This is my house!" I calmly reached over to Richard and took the thick red legal folder from his hands. I held it up, the bright crimson cover standing out sharply against the chaotic scene of ruined potato salad and subdued relatives. "Correction," I said, my voice projecting clearly over her frantic shrieking. "You just committed mortgage fraud on my house. I terminated the lease agreement an hour ago." Auntie Denise froze, her mouth slightly open before her gaze slowly swiveled toward Trevor. The entire yard followed her lead. The collective stare of 50 relatives locked onto the man still pinned face down in the dirt by my security team. Trevor was no longer struggling. He was hyperventilating, his expensive polo shirt soaked through with cold sweat. The silence in the backyard was absolute, thick with a tension so heavy it felt suffocating. I gave a slight commanding nod to Richard. My attorney stepped forward, his expression completely impassive, and pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from his leather briefcase. He did not hand it to Trevor. He did not hand it to my parents. He walked straight past the wreckage of the potato salad table and handed the document directly to Chloe. "Take a very close look at that document, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. "That is a bank-certified printout of a wire transfer initiated precisely 24 hours ago. Your husband attempted to move the entirety of your parents' liquid retirement assets into an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He hit a federal wire fraud tripwire the second he tried to bypass the international holding protocols." Chloe snatched the paper from Richard. Her eyes darted wildly across the page, scanning the highlighted routing numbers, the digital signatures, and the massive six-figure sum that represented my parents' entire life savings. Her hands began to tremble violently, the paper shaking in her grip. "But that is not even the interesting part." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Look at the secondary charge attached to the bottom of that account ledger. Trevor booked a private charter flight scheduled to leave tonight. A single passenger ticket. One way. No plus ones for a devoted wife or his beautiful children. He drained your parents dry to fund his escape from his failing logistics company, and he was fully prepared to flee the country, leaving you completely bankrupt and facing the federal fraud investigators entirely alone." The color instantly drained from Chloe's face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The elite influencer facade, the arrogant smirks, the endless bragging about her flawless marriage, it all dissolved in a fraction of a second. She stared at the paper, her mind struggling to process the monumental magnitude of the betrayal. She looked down at the man lying in the grass, the man she had allowed to insult and degrade me for years. "You were leaving us," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling before escalating into a raw, blood-curdling scream. "You were going to leave me." I gestured to the guards. "Let him up." The bodyguards immediately stepped back, releasing their tactical holds. Trevor scrambled to his knees, coughing and spitting dry grass, but before he could even find his footing, Chloe descended on him like a feral animal. She threw the bank document directly into his face and lunged, her manicured hands curling into tight fists. She battered his chest, his shoulders, his face screaming incoherently. The picture-perfect marriage they had flaunted for a decade shattered into a million humiliating pieces right there on the ruined lawn. Trevor raised his arms desperately, trying to shield his face from his wife's frantic, heavy blows. "Stop it, Chloe! Get off me!" he yelled, shoving her hard enough that she stumbled backward, her ruined designer dress catching on a stray folding chair. Trevor looked around wildly. He was cornered. His business was gone. His theft was exposed. His marriage was over, and the entire extended family was watching him with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He needed to run. He patted his pockets frantically, his hand finally closing around his keys. He locked his eyes on his massive, pristine black luxury SUV parked at the end of the driveway. It was his pride and joy, the ultimate symbol of the wealth he had pretended to possess. He broke into a desperate sprint, practically shoving past a group of stunned church elders. He aimed his key fob at the vehicle and jammed his thumb onto the unlock button, desperate to climb inside, lock the doors, and speed away from the disaster he had created. He pressed the button. Nothing happened. The headlights did not flash. The doors did not unlock. He hit the button again, harder this time, his breathing turning into panicked, ragged gasps. "Open!" he screamed at the car, slamming his palm violently against the tinted driver's side window. "Open the door!" A heavy, vibrating rumble interrupted his shouting. A massive commercial tow truck turned the corner, its diesel engine growling loudly as it backed its way into the driveway, rolling directly toward Trevor's beloved SUV. The flashing amber lights of the tow truck reflected off the glossy black paint of his car. Trevor spun around, staring at the truck in utter disbelief. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a manic, terrified realization. I stood on the walkway, perfectly composed, watching him completely unravel. I offered him a sharp, merciless smile. "Did you really think I would keep paying the lease on a car driven by a man who insults me in my own home?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "That SUV has been in my name since the day you begged me to co-sign for it to save your credit score. I canceled the contract this morning. You have absolutely nothing left." The tow truck driver hopped out, completely ignoring Trevor's frantic protests, and began hooking heavy steel chains to the front axle of the luxury vehicle. Trevor stood there in the driveway, covered in dirt, grease, and sweat, watching the last symbol of his fake elite status get dragged away down the street. Back on the lawn, the full crushing weight of the situation finally crashed down on Brenda. She stood paralyzed near the rusted grill, her eyes darting between the eviction notice Marcus was holding, the ruined catering setup, her sobbing covered in garbage daughter, and her golden son-in-law, who had just been exposed as a fleeing thief. Everything she valued, her social standing, her pristine church reputation, her financial security, and her favorite child's perfect life, had been completely obliterated in less than 5 minutes. The aunts and uncles were openly pointing and whispering now. The judgment Brenda had spent her entire life weaponizing against me was finally turned directly onto her. There was nowhere to hide. There was no lie big enough to cover up the absolute wreckage of her life. Brenda's breathing became ragged. She gripped the front of her expensive blouse, her knuckles turning bone white. She let out a high-pitched, wavering shriek, her eyes rolling back as her knees buckled. She collapsed heavily onto the sunburned grass, clutching her chest and writhing dramatically. "My heart," Brenda screamed, her voice echoing over the distant hum of the tow truck. "Call an ambulance! I am having a heart attack!" The wailing of sirens soon replaced the heavy rumble of the tow truck, cutting sharply through the stunned silence of the suburban backyard. Paramedics swarmed the property, pushing through the bewildered crowd of relatives with a stretcher and heavy medical bags. Brenda was putting on an absolute masterclass in theatrical suffering. She lay in the dry grass, clutching the collar of her ruined blouse, gasping dramatically for air, and letting her eyes roll back in her head every time a medic attempted to check her pulse. They hoisted her onto the stretcher, carefully navigating past the collapsed potato salad table and the lingering smell of burnt hot dogs. Marcus hovered right beside the stretcher, playing the role of the distraught and devoted husband to absolute perfection. But just as the paramedics began to load Brenda into the back of the waiting ambulance, Marcus stopped. He turned around, his face flushed a dangerous crimson, and marched back down the driveway toward me. He raised a trembling, accusatory finger, pointing it directly at my face so the remaining church elders and nosy aunts could witness his righteous anger. "Look what you did to your mother!" Marcus bellowed, his voice raw with manufactured grief. "You pushed her to the absolute brink. You caused this heart attack with your vicious, greedy stunts. You are going to pay every single cent of these medical bills, Maya. I will take you to court and make you cover this entire hospital stay. You owe us that much after nearly killing her in her own backyard." I stared at his shaking finger, utterly unfazed by his loud public guilt trip. "I owe you absolutely nothing, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and projecting clearly over the idling engine of the ambulance. "But I will follow you to the emergency room. Not to pay your bills, but to make sure you do not try to spin this medical emergency into another convenient lie for the extended family. I signaled to my security detail and Richard. We left the destroyed cookout behind, stepping into the climate-controlled quiet of my SUV while Marcus climbed into the back of the ambulance. The sterile fluorescent glow of the hospital waiting room was a sharp, biting contrast to the chaotic heat of the backyard. Marcus was pacing the worn linoleum floor, dramatically wringing his hands and accepting sympathetic pats on the back from a few loyal church members who had followed us to the hospital. I sat quietly in a corner plastic chair, Richard beside me, reviewing a stack of legal documents, my bodyguard standing silently near the entrance. I was completely detached from Marcus and his exhausting performance. The heavy double doors of the emergency bay hissed open. The attending physician stepped out, a silver clipboard in his hand and a stethoscope draped around his neck. He scanned the crowded waiting room, his eyes sweeping past Marcus before landing directly on me. A genuine bright smile broke across his tired face. "Maya," he called out, his voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room. I stood up, allowing a real smile to mirror his. It was Julian. We had endured 4 grueling years of undergraduate studies together, spending countless nights in the university library, surviving brutal economics and advanced biology exams before our career paths ultimately diverged. I had built a massive corporate tech empire, and he had become one of the most respected emergency medicine physicians in the city. "Julian," I said, stepping forward to warmly shake his hand. "It has been entirely too long. I wish the circumstances of our reunion were a bit better." Julian chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It is always good to see you, Maya." He then turned his attention to Marcus, who had stopped his dramatic pacing and was staring at our friendly exchange with visible confusion and rising panic. Julian cleared his throat, his demeanor instantly shifting from warm college friend to a clinical, completely unimpressed medical professional. "Are you Brenda's husband?" Julian asked, his tone flat and purely businesslike. Marcus puffed out his chest, stepping forward to aggressively reclaim the narrative in front of his church friends. "Yes, doctor. Please tell me my wife is surviving this massive heart attack. It was brought on by severe emotional trauma caused by my estranged daughter over there." Julian looked down at his clipboard, sighed heavily, and looked Marcus dead in the eye. "Your wife is fine. It is a panic attack brought on by stress. Her heart is perfectly healthy." The words dropped into the waiting room like heavy stones. Marcus froze, his mouth hanging open in mid-sentence. He looked around frantically, realizing that the church members who had accompanied him were now staring at him with deep, uncomfortable skepticism. But she collapsed. Marcus stammered, his face turning a dark, mottled shade of red. She was clutching her chest. She said her heart was failing. Julian adjusted his glasses, his expression devoid of any sympathy. "Her EKG is completely normal. Her blood panels show absolutely no signs of cardiac distress. Her oxygen levels are perfect. She experienced an acute anxiety episode, likely triggered by a sudden spike in adrenaline or an uncomfortable social situation. We have given her a mild sedative and a glass of water. She is sitting up in bed complaining about the quality of our hospital blankets. You can take her home in 20 minutes. Julian turned back to me, giving me a knowing nod before disappearing back through the double doors. Marcus was left standing in the center of the room, completely exposed. His grand medical emergency was a total sham. The guilt trip he had tried to leverage against me to extract more money was entirely invalidated by a licensed medical professional. Before Marcus could even attempt to recover from this humiliating reality check, the sliding glass doors of the emergency room entrance opened. Chloe walked in, looking entirely disheveled and frantic. She had clearly gone home to change out of her ruined mayonnaise-covered sundress, now wearing baggy sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, but she still smelled faintly of charcoal smoke. Trailing nervously behind her were her 2 young children. Chloe rapidly surveyed the waiting room. She saw Marcus standing silently in utter defeat. She saw me sitting calmly with my legal team. She instantly deduced that the heart attack narrative had failed and the medical guilt trip was a bust. Desperation is a dangerous thing, and Chloe was completely out of options. With her husband exposed as a fleeing thief, her home gone, and her mother exposed as a faker, she pivoted to the lowest, most toxic tactic available. She decided to weaponize her own children. She grabbed her son and daughter by their shoulders and physically pushed them forward. The kids stumbled slightly, looking terrified by the sterile hospital environment and their mother's frantic manic energy. Chloe pointed directly at me. "Go to her!" Chloe hissed, her voice vibrating with manipulative intent. "Tell Auntie Maya, please don't make us live on the street. Tell her you are sorry she hates our family." The entire waiting room went dead silent. Even the hospital receptionist stopped typing to stare at the sheer cruelty of a mother using her innocent children as human shields for her own financial crimes. The kids stood frozen in the middle of the room, their eyes wide and brimming with tears. They had no idea what was happening. They just knew their mother was angry, and their lives were falling apart. I felt a massive spike of pure disgust toward Chloe, but I did not let it show on my face. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly toward the children. I ignored Chloe completely. I knelt down to eye level with my niece and nephew, offering them a gentle smile. "Auntie Maya isn't making you homeless. In fact, I've already prepaid a 1-year lease on a nice apartment for you and your mom. But your dad won't be joining you." Chloe snatched her children back, her face a mask of absolute shock and utter confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form a single syllable, the automatic glass doors of the emergency room hissed open with violent, jarring force. Trevor stumbled into the sterile, brightly lit lobby. He looked absolutely deranged. The slick, polished corporate golden boy persona had been entirely stripped away, leaving behind a sweaty, grass-stained shell of a man. His designer polo shirt was torn at the collar from his rough encounter with my security team, and dirt was smeared across his cheek. His breathing was heavy and ragged, echoing loudly in the quiet waiting area. He had just watched his luxury SUV get towed away by a commercial truck. He had just realized his Cayman Islands wire transfer had been permanently blocked. He was trapped completely penniless and backed into a desperate corner. Like any cornered rat, he decided to bare his teeth. He locked his manic, bloodshot eyes on me and marched across the linoleum floor, completely ignoring his weeping wife and his terrified children. He invaded my personal space, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me, instinctively reverting to the aggressive boardroom tactics he used to bully junior executives. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya." Trevor hissed, his face red and a thick vein pulsing in his neck. "You think you have won today, but you have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I know people. I have high-level contacts at every major financial publication in this city. If you do not unfreeze that offshore transfer right now and call off the tow truck, I am going directly to the press. I will tell them everything. I will tell them you are running an illegal monopoly. I will claim your entire tech empire is built on antitrust violations, corporate espionage, and predatory acquisitions. I will bury your company in so much bad publicity and federal scrutiny that your stock will flatline before the market even opens on Monday morning." I looked up at him, taking in his desperate, sweaty face and his trembling jaw. The sheer audacity of his threat was so completely untethered from reality that I could not contain myself. I laughed. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a full, loud, genuine laugh of pure amusement that echoed off the hard hospital walls and drew curious stares from every nurse and patient in the lobby. I laughed right in his face, watching his bravado crumble under the weight of my absolute disregard for his threats. "Go ahead, Trevor," I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt and icy amusement. "Call the press. Call every single journalist you know. Tell them exactly who you are. The press loves a story about a white man committing wire fraud and elder abuse against a black family. I am sure the optics will be great for you. They will put your mugshot on the front page of every digital paper in the country. You will not be the victim, Trevor. You will be the ultimate, universally despised villain." The remaining color drained entirely from his face. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He had no leverage. His threats were empty, pathetic illusions. He looked around the lobby, his eyes darting frantically from my towering security guards to the hospital staff, who were now whispering and pointing at the unhinged man screaming in the emergency room. The flight response took over his entire body. He spun around on his heels, abandoning his family for the second time that day, and bolted toward the sliding glass exit doors. He never made it outside. As the automatic doors hissed open to the cool evening air, two tall men in unassuming plain clothes stepped firmly into his path, blocking the exit completely. They did not look like hospital security. They radiated a calm, lethal authority. The taller of the two men reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold badge. Trevor Blackwood, the agent, said, his voice flat, loud, and commanding. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted international money laundering. Trevor stumbled backward, his hands flying up in the air, as if he could physically ward off the federal charges raining down on him. He looked wildly over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "You did this!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You set me up!" "I did not set you up, Trevor," I replied, stepping forward so he could hear every single word clearly. "You dug this grave all by yourself. You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else in the room. But my legal team flagged your initial unauthorized access to my parents' accounts last week. Richard forwarded all the evidence, the forged signatures, the IP login logs, the offshore routing numbers directly to federal authorities days ago. They have been watching your every digital move, just waiting for you to attempt the final irrefutable transfer. You walked right into a federal trap." The second agent grabbed Trevor by the shoulder, spinning him around forcefully and twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the emergency room lobby, sounding like a judge's gavel slamming down on his life. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed him. The arrogant corporate executive was gone forever, replaced by a sobbing, pathetic coward. As the agents began to march him toward the exit, Trevor dug his heels into the polished floor, twisting his head to look back at the waiting room. He ignored his weeping wife, who was staring in horror. He ignored his frightened children. Instead, he locked eyes on the man who had always bailed him out of every single inconvenience. Marcus Trevor screamed, his voice raw with terror, echoing down the sterile hospital corridor. "Marcus, help me! You have to help me! Call a lawyer, pay my bail. Do not let them take me away." Marcus, who had just stepped out of the patient bay area after being utterly humiliated by Julian, stood frozen near the reception desk. Hearing the golden boy cry out for help triggered decades of deep, ingrained conditioning. Without even thinking, Marcus instinctively reached his hand into the back pocket of his trousers, reaching for his wallet to solve Trevor's problems with a blank check. He gripped the leather wallet, and then the crushing, devastating reality of his new existence hit him like a runaway freight train. Marcus slowly pulled his hand out of his pocket, letting his arm drop limply to his side. He stared at his son-in-law, the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, being dragged away in federal handcuffs. He could not pay Trevor's bail. He could not hire a high-priced defense lawyer. He could not even pay for a taxi ride home, because the man screaming for his financial help was the exact same man who had just stolen every single cent he had. The echo of federal handcuffs snapping shut around Trevor's wrists had barely faded from the hospital lobby before Marcus and Brenda retreated to their ultimate comfort zone. They chose absolute, unapologetic denial. Despite the undeniable reality of their financial ruin, despite witnessing their golden son-in-law being hauled away for federal wire fraud, and despite the perfectly legal eviction notice Marcus was still clutching in his sweaty hand, they flatly refused to vacate the property. They truly believed they could simply bully their way out of a legally binding eviction, just like they had bullied their way through life. When intimidation failed and the local sheriff's department made it clear they would be forcibly removed by the end of the month, desperation took over completely. Marcus and Brenda scraped together the absolute last of their hidden cash, likely by pawning whatever jewelry Chloe had managed to salvage from her crumbling marriage, and they hired legal representation. They could not afford a respected firm. They could not even afford a mediocre firm. Instead, they found Gary Vance a discount sleazy attorney whose face was plastered on cheap peeling billboards along the interstate highway. Gary immediately filed a desperate, frivolous lawsuit against me for unjust enrichment and emotional distress. Marcus and Brenda were banking on the exact same toxic strategy they had weaponized against me my entire life. They assumed I would ultimately fold under the crushing pressure of family guilt. They genuinely believed I would offer them a massive cash settlement and let them keep the Beacon Hill house just to avoid the public embarrassment of a messy, drawn-out legal battle. They vastly underestimated my resolve. 3 weeks later, we all sat in the freezing glass-enclosed conference room of Richard's downtown law firm. The contrast across the polished mahogany table was almost comical. I sat perfectly composed in a tailored charcoal suit, sipping sparkling water completely unaffected by the glare my mother was shooting in my direction. Richard sat beside me looking sharp, relaxed, and utterly lethal. His legal team was arranged behind us like a silent, impenetrable wall. Across the table, the situation was remarkably grim. Marcus was sweating profusely through a cheap, ill-fitting suit jacket, constantly pulling at his collar. Brenda was clutching a crumpled tissue, aggressively performing her frail, victimized mother routine for the benefit of the court reporter. Chloe sat silently in the far corner, staring blankly at the wall, completely hollowed out by her impending divorce and Trevor's ongoing federal indictment. Gary Vance, however, was practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He clearly thought this was his big break, a chance to extort a wealthy tech CEO and make a name for himself. As the deposition officially began, Gary came out swinging. He leaned aggressively across the wide table, pointing a cheap plastic pen directly at my face. He launched into a loud, rambling monologue accusing me of systematic financial abuse. He claimed I had maliciously orchestrated the ruin of my own family, intentionally driving Trevor to commit wire fraud just to punish my parents for past grievances. He threw around buzzwords like emotional manipulation and breach of familial duty, hoping to rattle me. I did not blink. I did not interrupt. I just watched him sweat. Richard simply sat back in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers, completely content to let this discount lawyer dig a massive, inescapable hole for his clients on the official legal record. After 45 minutes of Gary grandstanding and throwing baseless accusations into the sterile air of the conference room, Richard finally leaned forward. He calmly adjusted his pristine cuffs and pulled a single thin manila folder from his leather briefcase. He did not raise his voice. He did not match Gary's frantic, aggressive energy. He simply opened the folder, extracted a single piece of paper, and slid it smoothly across the expansive table until it rested directly in front of Marcus. "Take a very close look at Exhibit A." Marcus Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register that demanded absolute attention. "That is a home equity line of credit document filed against the secondary property my client generously allowed you to reside in. It is dated November 12th of last year. It authorized the immediate withdrawal of $150,000 from the property's equity. It requires the signature of the primary property owner to be legally binding. My client did not sign this document." Richard paused, letting the heavy, terrifying silence wrap around the room like a suffocating blanket. He locked his eyes onto Marcus, who had suddenly stopped breathing. "Did you or did you not sign this HELOC document on the night of November 12th? Marcus stared down at the paper as if it were a live explosive device. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down his forehead and dropped onto the collar of his shirt. He was completely, undeniably trapped. He knew exactly what Richard was doing. If Marcus admitted to signing the document, he was confessing to forging my signature to steal a massive line of credit. If he denied signing it, the only other person living in that house who could have possibly forged the document was sitting right next to him. Marcus hesitated, his mouth opening and closing silently as he desperately tried to find a lie that would protect Brenda while saving himself. He looked at his trembling hands. He looked at Gary. He looked at his wife. The silence stretched on, agonizing and heavy thick with the impending reality of federal prison. Brenda felt the walls of the conference room closing in on her. Her frail, victimized mother facade vanished in an absolute instant, replaced entirely by her raw, unfiltered instinct for pure self-preservation. She could not handle the crushing silence. She could not handle the intense, suffocating pressure of being cornered. She cracked. Brenda bolted upright in her heavy leather chair, pointing a violently trembling finger directly at her husband. "He made me do it!" Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and echoing violently off the thick glass walls of the room. "It was his idea. He told me to sign her name. He forced me to do it." The entire room froze. The court reporter's fingers stopped hovering over her keyboard, her eyes wide as she processed what had just been said. Gary Vance slowly lowered his cheap plastic pen. He stared at Brenda, his mouth hanging slightly open, his eyes wide with absolute unfiltered horror. The realization hit the discount lawyer like a physical blow to the chest. His clients had just loudly, explicitly, and voluntarily confessed to felony forgery and grand theft on a recorded sworn legal transcript. Gary slowly stood up. He did not say a single word to Marcus. He did not look at Brenda. He calmly closed his yellow legal pad, clicked his battered briefcase shut, and picked it up by the handle. "I am withdrawing as counsel," Gary stated flatly, turning his back on his stunned, ruined clients right in the middle of the deposition. "Good luck." The heavy oak doors of the law firm slammed shut behind Gary Vance, sealing Marcus and Brenda inside the glass-walled conference room with the suffocating realization of their impending doom. Without legal representation, their frivolous lawsuit evaporated into thin air. There would be no miraculous settlement, no family guilt trip, and no salvation. The legal slaughter was absolute and final. Exactly 30 days later, the eviction deadline arrived. The morning air was crisp and unforgiving as the sun rose over the pristine, manicured lawns of the Beacon Hill neighborhood. I did not drive down to the property to watch them leave. I had absolutely no desire to gloat or participate in a dramatic front yard shouting match. I had spent my entire life being dragged into their chaotic emotional theater, and I was entirely finished playing my assigned role. Instead, I sat in my downtown corner office, quietly reviewing international expansion contracts, while the legal system functioned exactly as it was designed to do. At precisely 8 in the morning, two stern sheriff's deputies walked up the cobblestone driveway of the estate. They bypassed the ornate fountain, climbed the marble steps, and knocked heavily on the custom front door. The sound echoed through the quiet, affluent street like a tolling bell. Inside the house was a portrait of frantic, disorganized desperation. Because Marcus and Brenda had squandered their last remaining funds on Gary Vance, they could not afford a professional moving company. The sprawling luxury they had lorded over me for years was now being hastily shoved into whatever cheap containers they could find. Outside, a rusted, dented rental van idled roughly against the curb, leaking a steady drip of dark oil onto the pristine pavement. The contrast between the magnificent architecture of the home and the pathetic reality of their exit could not have been more stark. As the deputies politely but firmly escorted my parents out the front door, the true punishment began. The neighborhood was wide awake. The church elders, the nosy choir directors, and the judgmental Sunday school teachers who lived on the same prestigious block were all standing on their front lawns. They held their morning coffees, pretending to water perfectly hydrated rose bushes or retrieve newspapers, but their eyes were locked entirely on the spectacle unfolding at my parents' address. These were the exact same people Brenda had relentlessly bragged to for decades. These were the women she had weaponized against me, loudly complaining about her ungrateful, difficult daughter while soaking up their sympathetic validation. Now those same women watched in stunned silence as Brenda shuffled down the long driveway. She was completely unrecognizable. She wore a pair of massive, dark designer sunglasses in a desperate, futile attempt to hide her tear-streaked face from the devastating public scrutiny. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed in absolute, unfiltered humiliation. In her hands, she carried two heavy black plastic garbage bags bulging with her expensive country club blouses and tailored slacks. Marcus followed closely behind her, carrying a battered cardboard box overflowing with random kitchen utensils and framed photographs. He looked 10 years older than he had just a month ago. The arrogant swagger, the booming voice that commanded the church congregation, the constant need to dominate every room he entered, it was all entirely gone. He kept his eyes glued to the pavement, physically unable to meet the judging stares of his peers. The empire of lies he had built to protect Trevor and maintain his own ego had collapsed, burying him completely in the rubble. Chloe stood alone on the edge of the sidewalk, completely separated from her parents. She wore a faded sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy knot. The elite influencer lifestyle she had curated for her thousands of followers had vanished overnight. Trevor was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing years in prison for wire fraud and elder abuse. Her bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators. Her pristine, picture-perfect marriage was exposed as a hollow criminal sham. She slowly looked up at the towering columns and the sweeping roofline of the massive house. It was the house she had always assumed would be hers. She had fully expected to inherit the estate, the wealth, and the social standing, simply because she was the chosen favored child. She lowered her gaze from the grand architecture and looked down at her open palm. Resting in her hand were two cheap brass keys attached to a simple plastic tag. They were the keys to the modest, functional two-bedroom apartment I had secured for her and her children. As Chloe stared at those keys, a profound, crushing realization finally washed over her. She looked at Marcus and Brenda, who were busy shoving garbage bags into the back of the rusted rental van, completely consumed by their own ruin. They had never protected her. They had enabled a criminal husband, encouraged her arrogance, and ultimately led her to total financial devastation. I was the scapegoat. I was the daughter they had openly despised and constantly berated. Yet I was the absolute only reason she and her innocent children were not sleeping in a homeless shelter tonight. The crushing weight of her own complicity, the years of participating in my torment while reaping the benefits of my labor, finally broke through her profound delusion. Chloe squeezed the keys tightly in her fist, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she climbed into the passenger seat of the moving van. Hours later, the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long shadows across my office. The city lights flickered to life, reflecting in the floor-to-ceiling glass. I was packing my briefcase to leave for the evening when my personal cell phone buzzed against the polished mahogany desk. I glanced at the screen. It was a voicemail notification. The caller ID displayed Brenda's number. I hesitated for a brief second before pressing play, putting the phone on speaker. The audio filled the quiet office. There was no aggressive tone, no manipulative guilt-tripping, and no performative outrage. There was only the raw, ragged sound of a woman who had been entirely stripped of her pride, her wealth, and her illusions. Maya, Brenda whispered, her voice trembling, violently choked by heavy, genuine sobs. Maya, please, I am so sorry. We lost everything. We have absolutely nothing left. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but please, I am begging you, let me see you. Just give me one last meeting to make things right. Please, Maya, just one meeting. The voicemail clicked and ended, leaving behind a heavy, vibrating silence. I stood alone in my office, looking out over the sprawling city that I had conquered without their help. The woman who had spent 30 years making me feel completely worthless was now begging for my time. I picked up my phone. I did not call her back. I opened a new text message, typed a single concise sentence, and pressed send. Tomorrow at noon, the coffee shop on Fifth Avenue. Do not be late. The bell above the heavy glass door of the Fifth Avenue coffee shop chimed precisely at noon. I stepped inside, the rich, warm scent of roasted espresso and toasted vanilla immediately washing over me. The afternoon lunch rush was in full swing, filled with the loud chatter of corporate executives and hurried baristas. I scanned the crowded room and found them. They were sitting in a small, cramped booth tucked away in the darkest corner of the shop, completely hidden from the large display windows facing the street. There was no grand, sweeping entrance for Brenda today. There was no holding court, no loud, arrogant proclamations designed to draw the attention and admiration of the room. They looked incredibly small, almost invisible amid the busy afternoon crowd. I walked over with measured, deliberate steps and sat down across from them, setting my structured leather handbag on the empty chair beside me. The physical transformation of the two people sitting across from me was jarring. The pristine, custom-tailored suits and the outrageously expensive silk blouses that had defined their entire existence for decades were completely gone. Marcus was wearing a faded, generic button-down shirt that hung loosely, almost comically, over his shrinking frame. He did not look up when I took my seat. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the scarred, water-stained wood of the coffee shop table, his hands resting limply in his lap. He looked like a completely broken, hollowed-out shell of a man. Brenda sat rigidly beside him. Her hair, usually sprayed and teased into a flawless helmet of suburban perfection, was pulled back into a simple, messy clip, exposing the deep, exhausted lines and dark purple shadows etched around her eyes. The heavy gold jewelry she used to flaunt at every Sunday service was missing, undoubtedly pawned to pay for Gary Vance's disastrous legal services. The arrogant, untouchable facade they had wielded like a heavy weapon my entire life had completely evaporated. We sat in a heavy, suffocating silence for a full minute. There was no audience here for Brenda to perform for, no church elders to impress with false piety, no nosy neighbors to manipulate with tales of her ungrateful daughter. It was just the three of us, stripped down to the absolute ugly truth of our fractured relationship. Brenda finally reached out her hand, trembling violently as she wrapped her fingers around her disposable paper coffee cup. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 35 years, I saw absolutely no calculation in her eyes. I saw no hidden agenda. I saw raw, unfiltered defeat. "We were wrong, Maya," Brenda whispered, her voice cracking and wavering under the crushing weight of her devastating reality. The tears that welled up in her eyes and spilled over her cheeks were not a theatrical performance. They were real, born of genuine, unavoidable despair. We let pride and Trevor's lies blind us. We wanted so badly to believe in the perfect, wealthy image he sold us that we completely ignored the daughter standing right in front of us. We pushed you away. Please, you are our daughter. We have absolutely nothing left. Marcus did not say a single word. He simply nodded slowly, his gaze remaining fixed on the tabletop, tears silently pooling in his own eyes. The man who had confidently ordered me out of his house, who had aggressively threatened to sue me for his own financial mistakes, was completely shattered. The toxic empire of lies he had chosen to protect over his own flesh and blood had collapsed and crushed him beneath its weight. I sat quietly, my posture perfect, my expression completely neutral. I absorbed the apology I had spent my entire childhood praying to hear. A decade ago, those exact words would have brought me to my knees. I would have wept, forgiven them instantly, and handed over whatever they wanted just to feel the warmth of their acceptance. But sitting there now, watching them break down in a crowded coffee shop, I realized the desperate little girl seeking their approval no longer existed. I had built my own empire, my own security, and my own unshakable peace entirely without them. I looked at Brenda, feeling a profound, quiet stillness settle deep in my chest. "I forgive you," I said, my voice calm, even, and entirely devoid of malice. "I forgive you, because carrying hate is too heavy. It is a toxic poison that I refuse to let infect the beautiful life I have built. I forgive you for the years of emotional abuse, the constant degrading comparisons to Chloe, and the absolute betrayal of choosing a criminal over your own daughter." Brenda let out a ragged, desperate gasp of relief. She reached across the table, her hand stretching out as if to take mine. I pulled my hand back smoothly, resting it firmly on my lap. Her face fell instantly, the brief flash of hope dying in her eyes. "But forgiveness does not mean access." I continued, my tone hardening into an unbreakable, icy steel barrier. "My forgiveness is for my peace, not your comfort. It means I'm releasing the anger, but it absolutely does not erase the consequences of your actions. You made your choices repeatedly, deliberately, and with malice. You do not get to be in my life anymore. You do not get to attend my future weddings. You do not get to meet my future children. And you do not get to claim my corporate success as your own. We are completely done." The absolute finality of my words struck Brenda like a physical blow to the stomach. The fleeting relief vanished instantly, replaced by a surging panicked desperation. She leaned forward aggressively, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the edge of the table. The reality of their public eviction and their impending homelessness crashed over her all over again. "Please, Maya." Brenda begged, her voice rising in pitch, a frantic hint of her old manic energy returning. "We accept that. We know we ruined everything, and we do not deserve your love. But we have nowhere to go. Trevor took our entire retirement fund. The house is gone. The church congregation turned their backs on us the second the FBI arrested him. Just a small loan, just enough to get a small house or a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood. We will pay you back every single cent. Just a little grace, Maya." I looked at her desperate, tear-stained face, then down at my designer bag. I unclasped the polished gold hardware, reached inside the silk lining, and pulled out a plain, unsealed white envelope. I placed it flat on the table and slid it slowly across the scarred wood until it rested directly between Brenda and Marcus. Marcus lunged for the envelope. He could not stop himself. His absolute desperation completely overrode whatever shred of dignity he had left. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly tore the thick paper as he ripped the flap open. Brenda leaned in close, her breath hitching in her throat, her eyes wide with the pathetic, frantic hope of a woman who genuinely believed a single piece of paper would magically restore her vanished empire. They fully expected a cashier's check. They anticipated a figure with enough zeros to buy back their pride, secure a comfortable lease, and instantly erase the catastrophic consequences of their spectacular cruelty. Marcus reached two trembling fingers inside the envelope and pinched the contents. He pulled them out slowly, his face immediately contorted in utter, devastating confusion. He blinked rapidly, turning the paper over and over in his hands, as if desperately searching for a hidden bank draft tucked between the layers. There was no check. There were no routing numbers. There was no salvation. Resting in his sweaty palm were exactly two crisp, unwrinkled $100 bills. Marcus looked up at me, his jaw completely slack. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and deeply aged. Brenda stared at the meager cash resting on the scarred wooden table, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. $200. It would not cover a fraction of their massive legal debt. It would not secure a deposit on a lease. It would not even pay for a single week in a cheap roadside motel. I sat perfectly still, watching the exact moment their greedy, entitled illusions finally died. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, making sure my voice was crystal clear over the clattering espresso machines and the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "That is the exact amount you gave me when I packed my bags for college," I said, my words dropping like heavy anvils into the space between us. "Do you remember that specific afternoon, Marcus? Do you remember standing on the pristine front porch of your massive house, handing me two bills and explicitly telling me never to come back? You looked me right in the eye and told me I was a worthless investment. You completely washed your hands of me because I refused to play your toxic games." Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks, ruining whatever was left of her composure. Marcus could not look away from the two bills. He looked physically ill. "You told me I was a massive failure before my adult life had even truly started." I continued, slowly standing up and smoothing out the front of my tailored coat. "You invested absolutely everything you had into Trevor and Chloe, because they looked the part. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. Now you are exactly where your own choices led you. Consider your debt paid in full." I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. I turned my back on my parents, picking up my leather bag and walking away. I left them sitting in that dim, cramped corner booth staring at $200 while their entire world crumbled around them. Chloe had nowhere left to turn. The harsh reality of having to actually provide for her children hit her like a runaway freight train. The modest two-bedroom apartment I had prepaid gave her a secure roof over her head, but it did not provide groceries, electricity, or luxury vacations. The elite social media influencer deleted her accounts entirely. She is currently working 40 hours a week as a front desk receptionist at a busy local dental clinic. The designer dresses and expensive jewelry are entirely gone, replaced by sensible, inexpensive scrubs. She is exhausted and completely humbled, but for the first time in her pampered, sheltered life, she is actually learning how to be a functioning, independent adult. Brenda and Marcus fared much worse. The $200 was truly the last handout they ever received from me. They eventually managed to secure a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the gritty outskirts of the city, miles away from the manicured lawns and towering oaks of Beacon Hill. They no longer attend their prestigious Sunday church services. The crushing shame of their highly public eviction and their golden son-in-law's federal conviction keeps them entirely isolated. Brenda cannot bear to face the judgmental stares of the exact same women she used to gossip with. Marcus spends his days pacing the small, dingy apartment, completely stripped of the wealth and authority he used to wield like a weapon. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the coffee shop and stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright, warming my face and instantly banishing the last lingering chill of my childhood trauma. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp city air. I was completely, undeniably free. The heavy, toxic anchor of my family's impossible expectations had been permanently cut loose. As I hailed a passing cab, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and answered. It was Richard, my brilliant lead assistant. His voice was bright, crackling with intense professional energy. "The new European clients are ready for the pitch, boss," he said. I smiled, opening the door and stepping into the waiting car. "Tell them I will be right there." I closed the car door, settling into the plush leather seat as the vehicle merged into the bustling city traffic. That afternoon, pitch to the European investors was a resounding success, securing a multinational expansion that pushed my company into an entirely new stratosphere of wealth and influence. But more importantly, it marked the definitive end of my old life and the absolute beginning of my true legacy. 6 months later, the suffocating, freezing rain of that Boston night felt like a lifetime ago. The vibrant, booming bass of Afrobeat music echoed across the expansive wooden deck of my Malibu beach house. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of tangerine and gold, reflecting off the sparkling waters of the Pacific Ocean. Warm, salty breezes drifted through the open, sliding glass doors, carrying the mouth-watering scent of smoked brisket, grilled snapper, and perfectly seasoned ribs. It was not a stuffy, pretentious dinner party designed to impress church elders or secure country club invitations. It was a real cookout. The property was filled with the vibrant, unapologetic energy of pure joy. Laughter rang out over the music, deep and genuine. I walked through the kitchen, dodging a heated, hilarious debate about the best way to season potato salad. There was absolutely no tension in the air. There were no hushed whispers behind my back, no frantic calculations to maintain a facade of respectability, and absolutely no performative affection. Every single person occupying my home was there because they had earned their place in my life. This was my chosen family. Richard was by the outdoor bar, expertly mixing cocktails and laughing loudly with Julian, the ruthless venture capitalist, who had boldly humiliated Marcus and backed my vision when I had nothing. My lead engineers, the brilliant men and women who worked tirelessly to build my tech empire, were crowded around the massive custom grill, exchanging jokes and sharing plates piled dangerously high with food. My mentors, the seasoned executives who had guided me through the vicious corporate trenches, lounged comfortably on the plush outdoor sofas. This was a breathtaking portrait of Black excellence thriving in its purest, most authentic form. We were not shrinking ourselves to fit into anyone else's narrow, toxic definition of success. We were completely free, completely successful, and entirely bound by mutual respect and genuine love. I handed a chilled bottle of sparkling water to one of my senior developers, sharing a warm smile before excusing myself from the lively crowd. I needed a moment to soak it all in. I climbed the sleek spiral staircase to the second floor and stepped out onto the master bedroom balcony. The music from below faded to a pleasant rhythmic hum, I leaned my forearms against the cool glass railing, holding a glass of crisp white wine, and stared out at the endless expanse of the ocean. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shoreline was hypnotic, grounding me in the absolute perfection of the present moment. I took a slow sip of my wine and let my mind wander back to that terrible freezing night in Boston. I thought about the sheer terror I felt when the heavy front door slammed shut behind me, leaving me shivering in the torrential rain with nothing but a soaking wet coat and a dead cell phone. At the time, standing on that darkened sidewalk, it had felt like an insurmountable tragedy. It felt like the complete destruction of my entire universe. Looking down at the joyous celebration happening on my deck, surrounded by the towering palms and the luxurious sanctuary I had built with my own two hands, I finally understood the absolute truth. Losing everything that night in the rain was never a tragedy. It was an eviction notice. It was the universe forcefully removing me from a toxic, cramped life that I had entirely outgrown. I had spent 30 years desperately trying to contort myself into a shape that Marcus and Brenda would find acceptable. I had allowed them to siphon my energy, my money, and my self-worth just to maintain the hollow illusion of a family. The rain had washed all of those suffocating obligations away, leaving me stripped bare but completely free to rebuild my life exactly the way I wanted it. A gentle ocean breeze brushed past my face, bringing with it the unmistakable sound of my friends erupting into fresh, uproarious laughter from the deck below. People often assume that the best revenge requires actively destroying the people who hurt you. They think it requires malicious plotting, endless sabotage, and a bitter, consuming desire to watch your enemies suffer. I used to think I wanted to destroy them. But as I stood there wrapped in the warmth of the California sun and the undeniable reality of my success, I realized I did not have to lift a single finger to ruin my family. They had accomplished that entirely on their own. Trevor's unchecked greed had locked him in a federal prison cell. Chloe's blinding arrogance had trapped her in a life of exhausting minimum wage labor. Marcus and Brenda's profound entitlement had stripped them of their wealth, their home, and their precious social standing. Their ruin was simply the inevitable consequence of their own toxic choices. The ultimate, most devastating revenge was not dragging them down into the mud. The absolute best revenge was surviving the very worst they could do to me, rising above their petty, malicious cruelty and aggressively thriving. It was building an empire so massive and a life so incredibly beautiful that their toxic existence became nothing more than a faint, irrelevant memory. I took one final look at the golden horizon, raised my glass in a silent toast to the endless possibilities of my future, and turned back inside to join my real family. My peace was permanently protected, and my life was finally mine alone. The fading sunlight cast long, dancing shadows across the teak floorboards of the balcony, wrapping the entire Malibu coastline in a brilliant, fiery glow. I leaned against the cool glass railing, letting the profound truth of my realization settle deep into my bones. For so many years, I had operated under the exhausting, desperate delusion that my survival depended on earning my parents' love. I had believed that if I just achieved a little more, worked a little harder, or shrank myself a little smaller, they would finally see me. I had allowed their impossible standards to dictate my self-worth, completely unaware that their approval was a moving target I was never meant to hit. Now, looking out at the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, I understood that their rejection was never a reflection of my inadequacies. It was a glaring, undeniable reflection of their own profound limitations. They were simply incapable of loving anything they could not control. Down on the deck, the music shifted to an upbeat, nostalgic track, and a collective cheer erupted from my friends. I watched Richard attempt a complicated dance move, nearly spilling his drink, while the rest of my team howled with genuine, unbridled laughter. There was a raw, authentic beauty to the scene playing out below me. This was a family forged not by the random biological lottery of birth, but by deliberate, conscious choice. We were bound by mutual respect, shared struggles, and a fierce, unwavering commitment to seeing each other win. They had held me up when I was a terrified college dropout sleeping on a borrowed mattress, and they were standing right beside me now as I commanded a global tech empire. This vibrant, thriving community was the ultimate proof that I had built something far more valuable than a mere corporate portfolio. I had built a home. I turned away from the railing, setting my empty wine glass down on the small, polished stone table next to the outdoor lounge chair. As the glass clinked against the surface, my cell phone resting face up on the table began to vibrate violently. The sudden harsh buzzing cut through the ambient sounds of the ocean and the party below. The screen illuminated the darkening balcony, casting a harsh, artificial white light against the twilight. I stepped closer, my eyes catching the glowing numbers on the display. It was an unknown caller, but the area code was unmistakably Connecticut. It was Fairfield County. It was the exact geographic coordinate of my childhood trauma. I stood perfectly still, watching the phone vibrate across the smooth stone surface. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that line. It was Brenda or Marcus, sitting in their cramped, dingy apartment on the outskirts of Boston, desperately using a borrowed phone or a prepaid burner number to bypass the blocks I had already established on their personal accounts. They were likely calling with another pathetic, fabricated emergency, another desperate plea for cash disguised as a desire for family reconciliation, or perhaps just to hurl more toxic venom because their own miserable reality had finally become entirely unbearable. I stared at the glowing screen, waiting for the familiar suffocating wave of anxiety to wash over me. I braced myself for the sudden drop in my stomach, the erratic racing of my heart, the clammy sweat on my palms. I waited for that desperate, broken inner child to rise up and whisper that maybe, just maybe, this time they were calling to apologize. Maybe this time they were calling to finally tell me they were proud of me. But as the seconds ticked by and the phone continued its relentless buzzing, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no fear. There was no panic. There was no residual anger. There was no lingering, pathetic hope for validation. The emotional black hole that had consumed my entire youth was completely and utterly gone. The people on the other end of that phone were no longer the terrifying, omnipotent figures who dictated my reality. They were just two desperate, broken strangers attempting to reach a woman who no longer existed. They had absolutely zero power over me. Their words, their judgments, their desperate manipulations could not penetrate the fortress of peace I had built around myself. The geographic distance between Malibu and Connecticut was vast, but the emotional distance was infinite. I picked up the phone. The device felt completely weightless in my hand. I looked at the 10 digits glowing on the screen one last time. A calm, unbreakable resolve settled over my mind, as clear and deep as the ocean stretching out before me. I pressed my thumb against the red icon on the screen, declining the call. Instantly, the aggressive vibrating stopped. I tapped the screen 2 more times, navigating swiftly to the contact settings, and pressed the block caller button. I did it without a single second thought, without a shred of hesitation, and without a drop of guilt. It was the easiest, most natural movement I had made all day. The line was permanently severed. The heavy, rusting door to my past was not just closed, it was sealed shut and entirely bricked over. I dropped the silenced phone into my woven beach bag resting on the lounge chair, completely burying it beneath my towel and sunglasses. I did not need to look at it again. There would be no follow-up text messages, no voicemails to delete, no lingering dread. The silence that followed was not the heavy, oppressive silence of isolation. It was the beautiful, expansive silence of total liberation. I turned my back to the ocean, walking away from the balcony edge and heading back toward the spiral staircase. The rich, savory aroma of the barbecue drifted up to greet me, accompanied by the infectious sound of Julian loudly debating sports statistics with my lead developer. The warm yellow lights strung across the lower deck illuminated the smiling faces of the people who genuinely loved me. I descended the stairs, letting the heavy bass of the music vibrate through my chest, syncing with the steady, calm beating of my own heart. I stepped back onto the wooden deck, seamlessly melting back into the vibrant energy of the crowd. A fresh ice-cold drink was instantly pressed into my hand by a laughing friend. I tipped my head back and let out a deep, genuine laugh that blended perfectly with the sound of the crashing waves in the background. I was no longer the discarded daughter, the scapegoat, or the convenient punching bag. I had survived their absolute worst, and I had emerged entirely victorious. I was wildly wealthy, I was profoundly free, and I was completely undeniably untouchable. This story teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth boundaries and overcoming toxic family dynamics. Maya's journey demonstrates that true success is not found by seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, it requires the courage to walk away from emotional abuse, recognize your inherent value, and relentlessly build an independent life on your own terms. True justice often comes not from seeking active vengeance, but by removing your support and allowing toxic individuals to face the natural consequences of their actions. Share your own story of overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comments below and subscribe for more.